One night, one secret. The billionaire CEO and his assistant trapped in a hotel during a snowstorm. Hello, let's start another beautiful story. Welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let's go. Charlotte Evans watched the snowflakes dance against the private jet's window, her reflection a ghostly overlay on the darkening sky. The weather report she'd checked just hours ago hadn't predicted this. Then again, February in Montana was nothing, if not unpredictable. Ms. Evans, Harrison Blake's voice cut through her thoughts, precise as a surgeon's blade. The pilot's update? She turned from the window, meeting the steel-gray eyes of her employer. For 3 years, she'd perfected the art of maintaining eye contact with Harrison without revealing how each look affected her. He's concerned about the developing storm system, Mr. Blake. He's suggested we land at the nearest airport and wait it out. Harrison's jaw tightened, the only visible sign of his displeasure. At 38, he'd built Blake Technologies from the ground up, transforming it into a multi-billion-dollar empire. He didn't achieve that by letting something as trivial as weather dictate his schedule. The Henderson deal can't wait, he said, his attention already back on his laptop. Their board meets tomorrow morning. Charlotte nodded, though she knew he wasn't looking. She'd memorized his tells over the years, the slight furrow between his brows when he was frustrated, the way his fingers drummed against his thigh when he was deep in thought. Right now, his shoulders carried the tension of a man who'd spent the last decade refusing to acknowledge the existence of the word impossible. The plane lurched, causing Harrison's coffee to slosh dangerously close to his laptop. Charlotte was already moving, steadying the cup with one hand while using her body to shield his computer. Years of anticipating his needs had made such reactions instinctive. "Thank you, Ms. Evans." His voice held the same polite detachment it always did, but for a moment, barely a heartbeat, their eyes met, and Charlotte felt the familiar flutter in her chest. She straightened quickly, resuming her seat across from him. "Sir, perhaps we should consider—" The plane shuddered again, more violently this time. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, tension evident even through the static. "Mr. Blake, we need to make an emergency landing. The nearest airport is closed due to the storm, but there's a private airstrip near Whitefish that can accommodate us." Charlotte watched Harrison's expression darken. The Henderson deal was worth millions, possibly billions, and he'd spent months orchestrating it. But even Harrison Blake couldn't negotiate with a blizzard. "Very well," he conceded, closing his laptop with a decisive click. "Ms. Evans, what are our options once we land?" Charlotte was already pulling up information on her tablet. "There's a hotel near the airstrip, the lodge at Whitefish Lake. I can call ahead and secure rooms." She paused, studying the weather radar. "The storm system appears to be intensifying. We might need to stay overnight." Harrison's silence spoke volumes. In 3 years, they'd never spent a night away from the office together. Their relationship was professional, efficient, and carefully bounded by the walls of Blake Technologies. "Headquarters in Seattle. Make the arrangements," he finally said, his voice neutral. "But see if you can find us separate transportation to Henderson. I won't let this weather derail everything we've worked for." Charlotte nodded, ignoring the way her heart quickened at the word "we." To Harrison, she was part of his corporate machinery, a particularly well-oiled cog, but a cog nonetheless. Her feelings for him were her own private burden to bear. The descent was rough, the wind buffeting the small jet like a child's toy. Charlotte gripped her armrest, knuckles white, and caught Harrison watching her. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Concern. But it vanished so quickly. She might have imagined it. They landed safely, but the world outside was already transforming into a white nightmare. The car Charlotte had arranged was waiting, its headlights cutting weak paths through the thickening snow. As they loaded their overnight bags into the trunk, Charlotte felt the wind bite through her wool coat. She'd dressed for a business meeting in Helena, not a blizzard in Whitefish. Harrison slid into the back seat beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle like everything else about him. The driver pulled away from the airstrip, tires crunching through fresh snow. "The Henderson deal," Harrison said, breaking the silence. "We need to review the terms before tomorrow, once we're at the hotel." "Of course, Mr. Blake." Charlotte pulled out her tablet again, but her usually steady hands trembled slightly. The prospect of spending hours alone with Harrison, reviewing contracts in some hotel room, sent equal waves of anticipation and dread through her. The car's headlights illuminated swirling walls of white. Through the windshield, Charlotte could barely make out the road ahead. They were only 15 minutes from the hotel, but in this weather, it might as well have been 15 hours. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that this storm was about to trap them in, ways neither could have predicted. As they drove through the deepening night, the universe was conspiring to force two people who'd spent years maintaining careful distance to confront the tension they'd both pretended didn't exist. The snow fell harder, and somewhere in the darkness, ahead, the lodge at Whitefish Lake waited, soon to become either a prison or a sanctuary, depending on how the next few days unfolded. The lodge at Whitefish Lake loomed through the snow like a mountain materialized from darkness. Their driver, having crawled at a snail's pace for the last 20 minutes, finally pulled under the covered entrance. Charlotte immediately noticed something was wrong. The usual warm glow of a luxury hotel was conspicuously absent. "Power's been flickering," the front desk clerk explained as they checked in, her flashlight beam bouncing off wood-paneled walls. "We're running on generators, but with the storm," she shrugged, apologetic. "We're trying to conserve energy. The good news is all our rooms have fireplaces." Charlotte felt Harrison stiffen beside her. He'd spent the last decade engineering the future, building smart cities and automated systems. Now they were being thrust back into the dark ages. "We'll need a conference room," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to bending the world to his will. "My assistant and I have work to complete." The clerk's apologetic smile deepened. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blake. With the limited power, we're only operating essential services. But our luxury suites have sitting areas that could serve your purposes." Charlotte's heart skipped. She'd booked 2 standard rooms, assuming they'd work in a public space. Before she could speak, Harrison stepped forward. "Fine. Upgrade both. Our rooms." "Oh." The clerk's flashlight illuminated a computer screen. "I'm afraid we only have 1 suite left. With the storm, people have been—" She trailed off under Harrison's increasingly frigid stare. Charlotte jumped in, professional instincts taking over. "We'll take the suite for Mr. Blake. I'll keep my standard room." She turned to Harrison. "We can use your suite for work, sir." The clerk nodded gratefully and processed their changes. As she handed over their keys, the lights flickered ominously and then died completely. In the sudden darkness, Charlotte felt Harrison's hand brush against her lower back, steadying her. The touch was brief, probably unconscious, but it sent electricity through her body that had nothing to do with the hotel's power problems. "Allow me to escort you to your rooms," the clerk offered, already moving toward the stairs. "The elevators are offline, I'm afraid." They climbed 4 flights in near darkness, their shadows dancing grotesquely against the walls in the clerk's flashlight beam. Charlotte was acutely aware of Harrison behind her, his breathing slightly labored from the unexpected exercise. She'd never known him to be anything less than perfectly composed. Her room was first, 412, a standard corner room with a view that would have been spectacular if not for the whiteout conditions. The clerk helped her locate the complimentary flashlight and matches for the fireplace, then led Harrison to his suite at the end of the hall. "I'll meet you in 20 minutes, Ms. Evans," Harrison called back. "We need to review those contracts." Charlotte closed her door and leaned against it, allowing herself exactly 30 seconds to feel the weight of their situation. 3 years of carefully maintained boundaries, of suppressing every inappropriate thought and feeling, and now they were trapped together in a powerless hotel during a blizzard. It felt like the setup to either a romance novel or a horror story, and she wasn't sure which prospect terrified her more. She changed quickly in the dark, trading her pencil skirt for warm slacks and adding a cashmere sweater over her silk blouse. Professional, but comfortable enough for what promised to be a long night. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled her honey-blonde hair from its tight bun, letting it fall in waves past her shoulders. She never wore it down at work. It felt too intimate, too personal. 20 minutes later, she knocked on Harrison's suite door, tablet and backup battery pack in hand. He opened it immediately, and Charlotte's carefully constructed professional facade cracked slightly. Harrison Blake had removed his suit jacket and tie. The top buttons of his crisp white shirt were undone, and he'd rolled his sleeves up, revealing strong forearms dusted with dark hair. In 3 years, she'd never seen him looking so human. "The fireplace is lit," he said, stepping back to let her in. The suite was massive, with a separate sitting area dominated by a stone fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows across the room, creating an atmosphere that felt dangerously intimate. "Ms. Evans?" Harrison's voice pulled her back to reality. "The contracts?" "Yes, of course." Charlotte moved to the sofa, maintaining a professional distance as she pulled up the documents. Harrison sat beside her, closer than usual, she noticed, but the tablet screen made that necessary. They worked in the firelight, going over clause after clause, but something had shifted. Maybe it was the storm howling outside, or the primal comfort of the fire, or simply the lateness of the hour, but their usual rhythm felt different. Harrison's comments came slower, more thoughtful. Once, reaching to point at something on the screen, his fingers brushed hers, and neither pulled away quite as quickly as they should have. The wind rattled the windows, and Charlotte shivered despite the fire's warmth. Without a word, Harrison stood and retrieved a blanket from the bedroom. He draped it over her shoulders, his hands lingering for just a moment too long. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. He didn't return to his original position on the sofa, instead sitting slightly closer. The contract glowed on the tablet between them, but the words had become meaningless symbols. All Charlotte could focus on was the sound of Harrison's breathing, the scent of his cologne, and the dangerous knowledge that they were more alone together than they had ever been before. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the suite, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that threatened to sweep away 3 years of careful restraint in a single night. The contract lay forgotten on the tablet between them, its glow the only artificial light in the room. They'd been reviewing the same paragraph for 20 minutes, neither willing to acknowledge that their concentration had evaporated like snow on warm skin. Charlotte was acutely aware of how the blanket Harrison had given her smelled faintly of him, as if his brief touch had transferred some essence of his presence. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across his face, softening the hard lines she'd memorized over 3 years of stolen glances. "It's getting late," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps we should continue in the morning." Harrison didn't respond immediately. He was staring into the fire, his profile sharp against the flames. Without his usual rigid posture, he looked younger, more vulnerable. "Do you ever think about paths not taken, Miss Evans?" The question caught her off guard. In 3 years, they'd never discussed anything personal. What do you mean?" He turned to face her, and in the firelight, his grey eyes held something she'd never seen before, uncertainty, choices, moments when life offered two directions, and you chose one without knowing where the other might have led. Charlotte's heart thundered in her chest. Like taking this trip despite the weather warnings? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Perhaps. He stood suddenly, moving to the wet bar. Would you like a drink? I believe I saw some decent scotch earlier. She should say no. She should return to her room, maintain the professional distance that had defined their relationship. Instead, she heard herself say, "Yes, thank you." He poured 2 glasses, the amber liquid catching the firelight. When he returned to the sofa, he sat closer than before, offering her one of the glasses. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Charlotte felt the contact like an electric current through her body. "To paths not taken," he said softly, raising his glass. They drank in silence for a moment, the scotch warming her from within. Charlotte gathered her courage. "You've never talked like this before." "Like what?" "Like someone who questions their choices." Harrison swirled the scotch in his glass, watching the liquid catch the light. "Perhaps I've never been trapped in a powerless hotel during a blizzard before." He paused, then added more quietly, "with someone who sees more than they let on." Charlotte's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "You notice everything, Ms. Evans. It's what makes you exceptional at your job. The way you anticipate needs before they're voiced, how you handle situations before they become problems." He took another sip of scotch. "I've often wondered what else you notice." The air between them felt charged, dangerous. "Charlotte," she said suddenly. He looked at her, questioning. "My name. You've never used it, not once in 3 years." Something shifted in his expression. "Charlotte," he said, testing the name on his tongue. The sound of it sent shivers down her spine. "Why did you hire me?" The question had burned inside her for 3 years. "My qualifications were good, but not exceptional. There were more experienced candidates." Harrison set his glass down, turning to face her fully. "You were the only one who challenged me in the interview." "What?" "I asked how you would handle a situation where you disagreed with my decision. Every other candidate said they would defer to my judgment. You said you would present evidence to change my mind, and if you truly believed I was making a mistake, you would fight for your position." Charlotte remembered that moment. She'd left the interview convinced she'd blown her chance. "I thought you hated that answer." "I respected it." His voice had dropped lower, more intimate. "I needed someone who saw me as a person, not an icon. Someone who would tell me the truth, not what they thought I wanted to hear." The confession hung in the air between them. Charlotte's heart was racing. "And have I told you the truth? About everything except yourself?" His eyes held hers, intense in the firelight. "You maintain this perfect professional facade, but sometimes I catch glimpses of something else. When you think I'm not looking, when you let your guard down for just a moment." Charlotte felt exposed, vulnerable. "We all wear masks, Mr. Blake." "Harrison," he corrected softly, "I think we're past formalities, don't you?" The use of his first name felt like crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Harrison," she whispered, testing the shape of it in her mouth. He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was gentle, almost reverent. "Your hair," he said. "I've never seen it down before. It's not professional." "Is that why you always hide it?" "To maintain the boundary between personal and professional." Charlotte couldn't breathe. His hand was still near her face, his thumb ghosting along her jawline. "Isn't that what you wanted? Clear boundaries?" "What I want," he trailed off, his eyes dropping to her lips for just a moment. "What I want and what I allow myself to have are often very different things." The storm rattled the windows, making them both jump slightly. The movement brought them even closer together, and Charlotte could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the scotch on his breath. "Tell me to stop," Harrison whispered, his face inches from hers. "Tell me this is inappropriate, that we should maintain our professional relationship, and I'll never cross this line again." Charlotte's heart was in her throat. 3 years of suppressed feelings, of professional distance, of careful boundaries, all of it balanced on the edge of this moment. "I can't," she whispered back. The confession hung between them for a heartbeat, then another. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the suite, time seemed to stand still, balanced on the knife's edge between what was and what could be. The grandfather clock in the corner struck midnight, its chime shattering the moment between them. Harrison pulled back abruptly, as if awakening from a trance. The loss of his warmth left Charlotte feeling cold, despite the fire's glow. "I apologize," he said, his voice rough. "The scotch, the storm, I shouldn't have—" "Don't!" Charlotte's voice was stronger than she felt. "Don't dismiss this as a mistake." He stood, running a hand through his dark hair. A gesture she'd never seen before. The perfect facade of Harrison Blake was cracking, revealing something raw underneath. "You don't understand," he said, pacing before the fire. "I can't. I don't do this anymore." "Do what? Feel something?" The words came out before she could stop them, fueled by 3 years of watching him hold everyone at arm's length. He turned to her, his expression haunted. "Feel something and then lose it." The weight of unspoken history hung in his words. Charlotte rose from the sofa, leaving the blanket behind. "What happened to you?" For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. The fire popped and crackled, and outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal. "Her name was Rebecca," he finally said, his voice so quiet she had to step closer to hear him. "She was everything I wasn't, spontaneous, emotional, full of life. We met in college, married young. Everyone said we wouldn't last, that we were too different." A bitter smile crossed his face. They were right. But not for the reasons they thought. Charlotte's heart ached at the pain in his voice. She wanted to reach for him, but sensed he needed space to tell this story. She was pregnant. The words fell like stones into the quiet room. 7 months. We were finally proving everyone wrong. I was working late, trying to get my first company off the ground. She called, asked me to come home early, said she wasn't feeling well. He turned to the fire, his shoulders rigid. I told her I had an important meeting, that I'd be home in a few hours. "Harrison," Charlotte breathed, already knowing this story wouldn't have a happy ending. By the time I got home, she was unconscious. Preeclampsia, the doctor said. They couldn't save either of them. His hands gripped the mantle, knuckles white. "I chose work over family, and it cost me everything." The silence that followed was heavy with grief. Charlotte moved closer, close enough to touch him, but didn't. "It wasn't your fault," he laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "Wasn't it? I built an empire on that guilt, Charlotte. Every acquisition, every merger, every billion added to the bottom line. It's all built on the foundation of that one choice. Work became my religion, because focusing on anything else meant facing what I'd lost. And that's why you keep everyone at a distance," she said softly. "Why you've never—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. He turned to face her, and the raw pain in his eyes made her breath catch. "I told myself I'd never put work before someone I—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "But look what I'm doing right now. We're stuck in this hotel because I insisted on making the Henderson meeting. Some patterns are too deeply ingrained to break." Charlotte stepped closer, her heart pounding. Or maybe the pattern is already breaking. The Harrison Blake I met 3 years ago wouldn't have told me this story. He wouldn't have let anyone see his pain. The Harrison Blake you met 3 years ago never had someone look at him the way you do. His voice was rough with emotion, like you see past every wall I've built. She reached up, touching his face gently. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch ever so slightly. "Maybe that's what scares you most," she whispered. "Not that you'll lose someone again, but that you found someone who makes you want to risk it." His hand came up to cover hers, holding it against his cheek. When he opened his eyes, they were filled with a conflict that broke her heart. "I don't know how to do this anymore," he admitted. "I don't know how to let someone in without feeling like I'm betraying her memory." "You don't have to know right now," Charlotte said, "but you don't have to be alone either." He looked at her for a long moment, then slowly pulled her hand from his face but didn't let it go. Instead, he interlaced their fingers, studying the way they fit together. "Stay," he said quietly. Not like that. Just stay. I don't want to be alone with these ghosts tonight." The request stripped away any remaining pretense between them. This wasn't about desire or professional boundaries anymore. This was about two people connecting in the dark, sharing the weight of old wounds and new possibilities. "I'll stay," she promised. They ended up back on the sofa, the fire burning low. Charlotte curled under the blanket, while Harrison sat at the other end, their joined hands the only point of contact between them. Neither spoke, but the silence was comfortable now, filled with understanding rather than tension. As the storm raged outside, Charlotte watched Harrison's profile in the dying firelight. He was still the brilliant, driven man she'd fallen in love with, but now she saw him fully, not just the successful CEO, but the wounded soul beneath. And somehow, knowing his pain, understanding his fears, only made her love him more. The question was, would that love be enough to help him break free from the ghosts of his past, or would the morning light find them back behind their carefully constructed walls, pretending this night of revelations had never happened? Charlotte awoke to pale sunlight filtering through frost-covered windows. For a moment, she was disoriented. This wasn't her room. Then she felt something warm against her hand and remembered she'd fallen asleep on Harrison's sofa, their fingers still intertwined. Except now, Harrison was gone, and what was warm against her hand was a cup of coffee, steam rising in the cold morning air. She sat up slowly, her neck stiff from sleeping awkwardly. The blanket that had been around her shoulders was now carefully tucked around her. "You seemed peaceful. I didn't want to wake you." Harrison's voice came from the window, where he stood silhouetted against the brilliant white world outside. He'd changed into fresh clothes, dark slacks and a grey sweater that made him look softer somehow, more approachable than his usual suits. "What time is it?" She reached for the coffee, grateful for its warmth. "Just past 7. The storm's stopped, but we're still without power." He turned from the window, and Charlotte felt her breath catch. In the morning light, with his guard down, he was devastatingly handsome. "The roads are being cleared, but it will be a few hours before we can leave." The practical details were a lifeline, something familiar to cling to after the intimacy of last night. "I should check on the Henderson meeting." "Already done." He moved to sit in an armchair across from her. "They've postponed until tomorrow due to the weather. Most of Montana is shut down this morning." Charlotte nodded, taking a sip of coffee, to hide her uncertainty. How were they supposed to act now? After everything he'd shared, after the walls that had crumbled between them, could they really go back to their professional dynamic? "About last night," Harrison began, then stopped, running a hand through his hair. That new gesture she was starting to recognize as a sign of emotional uncertainty. "We don't have to talk about it," she offered, though the words felt like glass in her throat. "I think we do." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I haven't told anyone about Rebecca. Not like that. Not the whole truth." Charlotte set down her coffee cup. "I won't betray your confidence." "That's not—" He made a frustrated sound. I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about what it means that I wanted to tell you, that I still want to tell you things. The admission hung in the air between them. Charlotte's heart thundered in her chest. Is that such a bad thing? It's terrifying. His honesty was disarming. I've spent 10 years building walls, Charlotte. Creating systems, routines, boundaries, everything in its place, everything controlled. And then last night, the walls came down, she finished softly. He nodded, and the sky didn't fall. The world didn't end. Instead, I felt... He trailed off, searching for words. Less alone, she suggested. Their eyes met, and the connection between them was almost physical. Yes, he whispered. Charlotte felt dizzy, light-headed. Whether from the intensity of the moment or something else, she wasn't sure. She stood, needing to move, but the room spun slightly. Harrison was beside her instantly, his hand on her elbow. Are you all right? Just stood up too fast, she said, but her stomach rolled unpleasantly. I should freshen up, change clothes. His hand lingered on her arm. Charlotte, she looked up at him, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her, but instead he stepped back, creating space between them. I'll order breakfast, he said. We should eat something before we head back to Seattle. She nodded, gathering her tablet and phone. At the door, she paused. Harrison! He looked up, and the vulnerability in his expression made her heart ache. Thank you, she said softly, for trusting me with your story, with your truth. Something shifted in his eyes, a softening, a warming. Thank you for being someone I could trust it with. The walk back to her room was a blur. Once inside, Charlotte barely made it to the bathroom before her nausea overwhelmed her. As she knelt on the cold tile floor, a thought occurred to her that sent ice through her veins. When was her last period? She sat back against the bathroom wall, her mind racing. The company Christmas party, 6 weeks ago. The open bar, the way Harrison had actually laughed at something she'd said. The one glass of champagne that had led to another and another. The way he'd insisted on sharing his cab since they lived in the same direction. The night she'd tried so hard to forget, when professional boundaries had blurred for just a few hours, before snapping back into place the next morning. They'd never spoken of it, both pretending it hadn't happened. But it had happened. And now... Charlotte closed her eyes, remembering the dizziness, the nausea, the subtle changes she'd been ignoring for weeks. Her cycle had always been irregular due to stress, so she hadn't thought. A knock at her door made her jump. Charlotte? Harrison's voice came through the wood. Breakfast is here. Just a minute, she called back, her voice surprisingly steady, considering her world was tilting on its axis. She stood, splashing cold water on her face and staring at her reflection. In the mirror, she looked the same. Charlotte Evans, efficient assistant, consummate professional. But everything had changed. Not just last night's emotional revelations, but this new suspicion taking root in her mind. She was probably wrong. Surely she was wrong. But as she changed into fresh clothes, her hands shaking slightly, she knew she needed to be sure. The front desk would have a pharmacy number. She could call, make arrangements for when they got back to Seattle. Take a test, know for certain. But as she opened her door to face Harrison, she realized the truth was already settling into her bones. Their night of revelations wasn't over. The biggest one was yet to come. She just had to figure out how to tell a man who'd lost everything, once that he might be about to gain everything, whether he was ready for it or not. The private jet hummed steadily at 30,000 feet, cutting through clear Montana skies that showed no trace of yesterday's storm. Charlotte sat across from Harrison, just as she had 24 hours ago, but everything felt different. The space between them crackled with unspoken words and half-formed possibilities. She'd been quiet during breakfast, picking at her food, while her mind raced with calculations and possibilities. Harrison had noticed. Of course he had noticed. He'd started watching her with a new intensity, as if trying to read the thoughts behind her careful expression. Now, halfway back to Seattle, she couldn't stop her hand from drifting to her stomach. 6 weeks. It seemed impossible, yet the more she thought about it, the more certain she became. That night, after the Christmas party. "Are you feeling ill again?" Charlotte startled, dropping her hand. Harrison was watching her over his laptop screen, concern evident in his grey eyes. The tenderness there made her heart ache. How could she tell him? How could she not? "Just a bit of turbulence," she lied, hating herself for it. He closed his laptop, giving her his full attention. Charlotte. The way he said her name now, soft, intimate, made her shiver. "Yes? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," she said too quickly. "I'm just processing." "Processing what happened last night?" His voice was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. Last night. It seemed like a lifetime ago. His confession about Rebecca, the almost kiss, falling asleep holding hands, before her world had tilted on its axis this morning. "Aren't you?" she countered softly. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the endless blue sky. "I keep trying to put the walls back up," he finally admitted, "to return to our professional dynamic. But I can't stop thinking about how it felt to be honest with someone, to be seen." He turned back to her, his expression raw. To trust someone again. Charlotte's eyes burned with unshed tears. He was finally opening up, finally letting someone in, and she was sitting here with a secret that could shatter everything. "Harrison, she started, but the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent into Seattle. Harrison's phone immediately lit up with notifications as they re-entered cell service. Just like that, reality came rushing back. She watched as his expression shifted, the vulnerable man from the hotel retreating behind the mask of CEO. "The Henderson team is waiting for updates," he said, already typing responses. "We'll need to restructure the entire presentation for tomorrow's meeting." Charlotte nodded, falling back on years of professional training. "I'll contact their office as soon as we land. Arrange for the new time." "Good." He paused in his typing, looking at her intently. "Charlotte, about everything that happened," her heart stopped. Was he about to suggest they forget it all, go back to their strictly professional relationship? "Yes," she managed. "I don't want to pretend it didn't happen." His voice was low, intense. I'm not ready for..." He struggled with the words. "But I don't want to go back to before." Relief and anxiety warred in her chest. "What do you want?" "Time," he said softly. "To figure out how to be someone who can..." He trailed off, running a hand through his hair in that newly familiar gesture. "Someone who can feel things again, without feeling like I'm betraying her memory." Charlotte's hand instinctively moved to her stomach again before she caught herself. Time was the one thing they might not have. The plane descended through Seattle's perpetual cloud cover, the city emerging below them like a dream materializing. In less than an hour, they'd be back in the office, surrounded by the corporate machinery of Blake Technologies. The intimacy of their snowbound night would seem like a fantasy. "Harrison," she said suddenly, urgently, "whatever happens, whatever changes between us, personally or professionally, I need you to know something." He looked at her questioningly. "You deserve to be happy," she said softly. "Rebecca would want that for you. She wouldn't want her memory to be a prison." Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, hope, fear. She couldn't tell. Before he could respond, the plane touched down with a gentle bump. As they gathered their things, Harrison stopped her with a light touch on her arm. "Have dinner with me tonight," he said. "Not as my assistant, not to work, just dinner." Charlotte's heart thundered in her chest. "Are you sure?" "No," he admitted with a ghost of a smile. "I'm terrified, but I want to try." She nodded, not trusting her voice. As they deplaned into the grey Seattle afternoon, Charlotte felt the weight of her secret pressing against her heart. She needed to know for certain before she said anything, needed to be absolutely sure before she risked upending his carefully reconstructed world. She watched him walk ahead of her, his confident stride carrying him toward the waiting car. He was trying so hard to open his heart again, one careful step at a time, and she was about to drop a bomb that could either bring his walls crashing down completely or send him retreating so far behind them she'd never reach him again. First, she needed to stop at a pharmacy. Then she needed to find the courage to tell him a truth that would change everything, for better or worse. The Seattle rain began to fall, soft and steady, washing away the last traces of Montana snow from their clothes. But nothing could wash away the knowledge growing inside her, or the fear of what it might mean for their fragile new beginning. The pharmacy bag felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in Charlotte's purse as she stood before her bedroom mirror. She'd taken 3 tests, all positive. The truth she'd suspected that morning was now confirmed, written in little blue lines. That changed everything. Her phone buzzed, a text from Harrison. "Car will pick you up in 20 minutes. Looking forward to seeing you." Charlotte closed her eyes, steadying herself. She'd chosen a deep blue dress that fell just above her knees, elegant but not overtly sexy. Her honey blonde hair was down again, the way he'd admired it at the hotel. Everything about her appearance was carefully chosen to walk the line between their old professional relationship and whatever they were becoming. The car arrived precisely on time, Harrison's hallmark attention to detail. The driver took her to Canlis, Seattle's premier restaurant, with its stunning views of Lake Union. Of course, Harrison would choose somewhere exceptional, even for what he'd called just dinner. He was waiting outside, and the sight of him made her breath catch. He'd changed from his office clothes into a charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, his dark hair slightly tousled from the persistent Seattle drizzle. When he saw her, his face softened in a way she'd only started seeing since their night in Montana. "Charlotte." He stepped forward, offering his hand to help her from the car. The gesture was gentlemanly, but his touch lingered longer than necessary. "You look beautiful." The simple compliment made her blush. "Thank you. You look—" She gestured vaguely at his appearance, making him smile. "Not my usual corporate." "Armor?" There was a self-awareness in his voice that was new, endearing. Inside, they were led to a private table overlooking the water. Seattle's lights sparkled on the dark surface, creating an intimate atmosphere that made Charlotte's heart race. This was really happening. A proper date with Harrison Blake. "I've never seen this side of the city," she admitted as they settled in. "It's beautiful. I used to come here often years ago." Something flickered across his face. "With Rebecca." Charlotte's hand tightened on her water glass. "We don't have to—" "No, it's okay." He met her eyes steadily. "That's why I chose it. I needed to know if I could make new memories here. Better to find out now at the beginning." The beginning! The word hung between them, full of promise and complication. Charlotte took a sip of water, trying to calm her churning stomach. Morning sickness, she now knew with certainty, not just nerves. "How was the Henderson preparation?" she asked, falling back on familiar territory. "Charlotte." His voice was gentle but firm. "We're not here to discuss work." She smiled weakly. "Force of habit. 3 years of professional conversation is hard to break." "Then let's break it." He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me something I don't know about you. Something that has nothing to do with Blake Technologies." The irony of his request wasn't lost on her. The biggest thing he didn't know about her was currently causing her queasiness. But she chose another truth instead. "I play the cello," she said. "Or I used to before work consumed everything. I haven't touched it in 2 years." His eyebrows rose with genuine surprise. "Why did you stop?" "Because perfect assistants don't have time for hobbies." As soon as she said it, she regretted the hint of bitterness in her voice. But Harrison didn't bristle at the implied criticism. Instead, he looked thoughtful. "I've done that to you, haven't I? Demanded such perfection that you've lost pieces of yourself?" "I chose it," she said softly, "because being near you, even professionally, was enough." The admission hung in the air between them. Harrison reached across the table, taking her hand. "It shouldn't have been enough. You deserve more than fragments of a life." Charlotte's eyes burned with sudden tears, damn pregnancy hormones, making everything feel more intense. "What about you? What pieces of yourself have you lost?" He was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "Joy," he finally said. "Spontaneity. The ability to live in the moment without calculating every risk, every possible loss." And now? His eyes met hers, intense and vulnerable. "Now I'm sitting across from someone who makes me want to find those pieces again." The waiter approached, and they reluctantly separated their hands to order. Charlotte chose carefully, hyper-aware of her condition. No wine, nothing too rich. Harrison noticed, of course. "You're not drinking?" "I'm taking a break from alcohol," she said, the partial truth tasting bitter on her tongue. As their main courses arrived, the conversation flowed more naturally. Harrison told her about his college days, before Rebecca, when he dreamed of being an architect. She shared stories about growing up in Portland, about the coffee shop she'd worked at through college, about the dreams she'd put on hold to pursue her career. "Why did you really take the job?" he asked as they finished their meals. "The real reason, not the professional answer you gave in the interview." Charlotte's heart raced. "Because I saw something in you that day, behind the corporate facade, behind the cold efficiency. I saw someone who needed, not an assistant exactly, someone who would see them, really see them." Harrison's expression was unreadable. "And what do you see now?" "A man learning to live again," she said softly. "Someone brave enough to try." He reached for her hand again, but this time her stomach lurched violently. She pulled away, standing, abruptly. "I'm sorry, I need—" She barely made it to the restroom before getting sick. Kneeling on the cold tile floor of Canliss's elegant bathroom, Charlotte felt tears sliding down her cheeks. This wasn't how the evening was supposed to go. When she emerged, Harrison was waiting in the hallway, his face etched with concern. "You're ill. Let me take you home." She nodded, too exhausted to argue. In the car, he pulled her close, and she let herself lean against him, breathing in his familiar scent. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" "Being human." His voice rumbled in his chest. "You've seen me at my most vulnerable. Did you think I couldn't handle seeing you at less than perfect?" Fresh tears threatened. If he only knew how imperfect, how complicated things were about to become. But for now, she just let him hold her as Seattle slid past the windows, trying to memorize how it felt to be in his arms before everything changed. Because tomorrow, she decided, tomorrow she would tell him the truth, and this fragile new beginning would either blossom into something remarkable or shatter completely. The city lights blurred through her tears, and Harrison's arms tightened around her as if he could protect her from whatever was causing her pain. If only he knew that the source of her turmoil was also the greatest gift and greatest challenge life could offer them both. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Blake Technologies, casting long shadows across Charlotte's desk. She'd arrived early, determined to catch Harrison before the day's meetings began. The 3 positive pregnancy tests were tucked in her purse, tangible proof she wasn't imagining this life-changing development. But Harrison's office was dark. A text message waited on her phone. "Early breakfast meeting with Henderson team. See you at the office." Charlotte's stomach churned. Though whether from morning sickness or nerves, she couldn't tell. She'd barely slept last night, rehearsing different ways to tell him. "Remember the Christmas party? That night meant more than we acknowledged. I'm carrying your child." Each version sounded more impossible than the last. The elevator dinged, and Charlotte straightened, but it wasn't Harrison who emerged. It was Diane Foster, head of the board of directors, her expression grave. "Is he in yet?" Diane asked without preamble. "He's at the Henderson meeting. Is something wrong?" Diane's lips pressed into a thin line. "Turner Tech is making a hostile takeover bid. They've been quietly buying shares for months. The news breaks in an hour." Charlotte's blood ran cold. Turner Tech was their biggest competitor, and their CEO, Victor Turner, had a personal vendetta against Harrison dating back to their college days. "I'll get him back here immediately," Charlotte said, already reaching for her phone. This was what she did best, anticipating needs, managing crises. Even with her personal world tilting on its axis, these professional instincts remained sharp. Harrison arrived 17 minutes later, his face already set in the hard lines she recognized from major business battles. Diane was waiting in his office with their legal team. "Charlotte, clear my schedule," he called as he strode past, "and get Victor Turner's office on the line." She moved to comply, but Harrison stopped at his door. "And are you feeling better?" The concern in his voice, this small, personal moment in the midst of crisis, made her heart ache. "Yes, thank you." He nodded, his expression softening for just a moment before he disappeared into his office. Charlotte could hear raised voices through the door as she began the process of rearranging his day. The morning passed in a blur of phone calls and urgent meetings. Charlotte kept everything running smoothly, but her hand kept straying to her stomach. Every time Harrison emerged from his office, she thought about pulling him aside, telling him, but his phone was constantly ringing, his attention consumed by the battle for his company's future. Around noon, he appeared at her desk. "I need you to pull all the files from the Davidson merger 3 years ago. There was language in that deal we might be able to use." "Of course." She stood, but a wave of dizziness hit her. Harrison caught her elbow, steadying her. "Charlotte?" His voice was low, concerned. "What's going on? You've been off since yesterday." This was it, her moment. "Harrison, I need to tell you something." His phone buzzed. Turner's name flashed on the screen. "I have to take this," he said apologetically. "But dinner tonight? We can talk then?" She nodded, watching him retreat back into his office. Through the glass walls she could see him pacing as he spoke to his rival, his free hand clenched at his side. The afternoon brought more complications. The Henderson deal, their reason for being in Montana, was now in jeopardy. Rumors of the hostile takeover had spooked them. Harrison needed her to revise the entire proposal, adding layers of security and assurances. By 6 o'clock, the office had become a war room. Lawyers and financial advisors crowded the conference room, strategy sessions running late into the evening. Charlotte coordinated everything, ordering dinner, managing information flow, all while fighting waves of nausea and fatigue. At 9, Harrison emerged from another tense meeting. He looked exhausted. His tie loosened, his hair mussed from running his hands through it. "Charlotte, I'm so sorry about dinner. This situation—" "I understand," she said quickly. "The company has to come first." Something flickered in his eyes at her words. "No," he said quietly. "That's what I always told myself with Rebecca. That work had to come first. I won't make that mistake again." He glanced at the conference room full of waiting executives. "Give me an hour to finish here?" Her heart swelled. Of course. But 20 minutes later, everything imploded. Turner Tech had convinced one of Blake Technologies' major shareholders to sell. The news hit the evening financial papers. Harrison's phone exploded with calls from other investors, many threatening to jump ship. He appeared at her desk one last time, his expression haunted. I have to fly to New York tonight. Our biggest shareholders are there. I need to talk to them in person, convince them to stand with us. Charlotte nodded, already pulling up flight options. This was familiar territory, the efficient assistant smoothing his path. Come with me, he said suddenly. She looked up, startled. What? Not as my assistant. Well, yes, I need my assistant, but also... He ran a hand through his hair. I need you. The way I needed you in Montana. The way I'm starting to need you every day. Charlotte's hand moved instinctively to her stomach. Going to New York would delay telling him, but maybe that was better. Away from the office, away from Seattle, she might find the right moment, the right words. I'll book 2 tickets, she said. He smiled, the first real smile she'd seen all day. Thank you. He touched her hand briefly, then hurried back to the conference room. Charlotte began making arrangements, her other hand still resting on her stomach. Their child was there, growing beneath her palm, blissfully unaware of hostile takeovers and corporate warfare. She had to tell him soon. Every day she waited made it harder. But as she watched Harrison fight for the company he'd built, she wondered, was she about to give him something precious to protect, or add another vulnerability his enemies could exploit? The answer would have to wait. For now, New York beckoned, and with it another chance to find the right moment to change everything. New York in February was bitter cold, the wind whipping between skyscrapers like invisible blades. From the 65th floor of their hotel, Charlotte watched snow swirl past the windows, reminded of that night in Montana that felt like a lifetime ago. Only a week had passed, but everything had changed, including the tiny life growing inside her, making its presence known with another wave of morning sickness. The Blackstone Group is wavering. Harrison's voice drew her attention back to the suite's living room, where he paced while on the phone. If they sell their shares to Turner... He caught her watching and gave her a wan smile, the kind that made her heart flutter despite everything. They'd been in New York for 2 days, running from one shareholder meeting to another. Harrison was fighting for his company with everything he had, and Charlotte was fighting her own battle, with nausea, with fatigue, with the weight of her secret. She'd almost told him last night. They'd ordered room service, too exhausted, to go out, and for a moment everything felt intimate and right. But then Turner's latest offer had come through, and the moment slipped away. No, I understand your concerns, Harrison was saying into the phone, but Blake Technologies' fundamentals are strong. Turner's offering short-term gains at the expense of long-term innovation. Give me until tomorrow's board meeting. I'll prove it to you. He ended the call and sank onto the sofa, looking more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him in a business context. Without thinking, Charlotte moved to sit beside him, taking his hand. You'll convince them, she said softly. They know what you've built, what you're capable of. He turned to look at her, his grey eyes intense. What we've built. I couldn't have done any of this without you, Charlotte. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. He shifted closer, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her. Her heart raced. This could be the moment, the right time to tell him everything. Harrison, there's something... His phone buzzed. Turner's name flashed on the screen. Ignore it, he said, surprising her. You were about to say something. Charlotte took a deep breath. That night after the Christmas party... The hotel room phone rang, sharp and insistent. Harrison's jaw clenched, but Charlotte was already answering it, professional instincts taking over. Mr. Blake's suite. Ms. Evans? It was Diane Foster, Turn on CNBC, now. Charlotte grabbed the remote, switching on the massive TV. Victor. Turner's face filled the screen, his expression smugly confident as he spoke to a reporter. Which is why I'm announcing that Turner Tech has acquired controlling interest in Henderson Systems. Harrison was on his feet instantly. What? The merger agreement Blake Technologies has been negotiating is now void, Turner continued. And without that projected revenue stream, I expect their shareholders will be very interested in our improved offer tomorrow morning. The room seemed to spin. Henderson had been their biggest pending deal, the cornerstone of their growth strategy. Without it, he planned this, Harrison said, his voice deadly quiet. The takeover bid was just a distraction while he went after. Henderson, he turned to Charlotte, get the legal team on the line. And call Richard Henderson. Maybe we can still... There's more. Diane's voice came through the speaker. Turner's calling an emergency shareholders meeting for 9 a.m. He's making his final move. Harrison's face hardened into the mask. Charlotte hadn't seen since Montana, the cold, calculating CEO who'd built an empire through sheer force of will. Book the conference room at Morton's for 7 a.m., he told her. Every major shareholder, full breakfast. If Turner wants a fight, I'll give him one. But as Charlotte made the arrangements, she saw something that made her blood run cold. An email from Turner's office, marked urgent, addressed directly to her. She opened it, hands shaking slightly. Ms. Evans, your dedication to Blake Technologies is admirable. But perhaps your personal relationship with Harrison Blake has clouded your professional judgment. The attached photos from the Whitefish Lodge might interest the board and the press, given the current climate of corporate governance scrutiny. However, Turner Tech always needs talented executives. Your experience would be invaluable to us, and we reward loyalty generously. Think about your future. Regards, Victor Turner. The attached photos showed her and Harrison in Montana, entering his suite, leaving together the next morning, his hand on her back as they walked to the car. Innocent moments, but in the current context. Charlotte, and felt sick, and this time it wasn't morning sickness. Turner was threatening to twist their emerging relationship into a scandal, potentially damaging Harrison's credibility right when he needed it most. And he was trying to buy her loyalty, unknowingly offering her a way out of her current predicament, a new job, a fresh start, no complicated explanations needed. She looked at Harrison, who was already deep in strategy discussions with their legal team. He'd trusted her with his pain, his past, his gradual journey back to emotional openness. Now she was carrying his child, and his enemy was trying to use her to destroy him. The choice seemed impossible. Tell Harrison everything now, adding personal chaos to his professional crisis, or wait until after tomorrow's showdown, knowing Turner might reveal the photos first and make everything look worse. She rested her hand on her stomach, feeling the weight of two lives in her hands. The tiny one growing inside her, and the life Harrison had rebuilt after losing everything once before. Outside the window, snow continued to fall on Manhattan, and somewhere in the city, Victor Turner was planning to destroy the man she loved. Charlotte had until morning to decide. Would the truth protect Harrison or shatter him completely? Dawn broke over Manhattan, painting the snow-covered city in shades of rose and gold. Charlotte hadn't slept. She stood in the private dining room at Morton's, making sure everything was perfect for the shareholders' breakfast. Her hand kept returning to her purse, where both Turner's email and a sonogram appointment card lay like twin bombs waiting to detonate. Harrison entered, impeccable in a fresh suit, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. They'd been up most of the night preparing his strategy. Now, watching him greet the arriving shareholders with calculated charm, she saw both versions of him. The brilliant CEO and the wounded man she'd held in Montana, and loved them both. Charlotte. He caught her arm as she passed, pulling her into a quiet corner. Whatever happens today, Mr. Blake. Victor Turner's voice cut through the room like a blade. He stood in the doorway, uninvited, radiating smug confidence. I hope you don't mind me crashing your breakfast. I brought some interesting reading material for the shareholders. Charlotte's heart stopped. Turner was holding a manila envelope. This is a private meeting, Harrison said, his voice dangerously quiet. Nothing's private in business, Blake. Isn't that what you taught me in college? Turner's eyes flickered to Charlotte, though perhaps you've forgotten that lesson recently. Charlotte saw the exact moment Harrison registered the threat in Turner's tone. His hand tightened on her arm. If you have something to say, Victor, say it. Turner smiled, cold and predatory. Your assistant checked into the Whitefish Lodge with you last week, shared a suite. Very cozy. He turned to the shareholders. Is this the kind of leadership you want? A CEO who blurs professional lines? Who lets emotion cloud his judgment? The room had gone deathly quiet. Charlotte felt Harrison's body coil with tension beside her. You're trying to create a scandal where none exists, Harrison said evenly. Ms. Evans and I were stranded by a blizzard, along with dozens of other travelers. Ah, but you've been seeing each other since, haven't you? Turner pulled photos from his envelope. Harrison and Charlotte at Canlis, his hand on her back as they left the restaurant. Your father would be disappointed, Harrison. Mixing business with pleasure, that's not the Blake way. Something snapped inside Charlotte. The mention of Harrison's father, the implied shame in what was growing between them. It was too much. Stop! Her voice rang out clear and strong. Every head in the room turned to her. Charlotte, Harrison warned quietly, but she stepped forward. You want to talk about judgment, Mr. Turner? Let's talk about a CEO so obsessed with revenge that he'd try to blackmail an executive assistant. She pulled out her phone, displaying his email. You offered me a job in exchange for betraying Harrison. You threatened to twist something genuine into a scandal. Murmurs rippled through the shareholders. Turner's smile faltered. What's genuine is irrelevant, he recovered smoothly. What matters is appearance, stability. Blake is emotionally compromised. First the Henderson deal falls apart, now this. The Henderson deal? Charlotte laughed, a sharp sound that surprised even her. You mean the deal you sabotaged because you couldn't beat Blake Technologies fairly? Because you know Harrison's vision for this company is better than anything you could offer? She turned to the shareholders, one hand pressed to her stomach for strength. You want to know about Harrison Blake's judgment? He built this company from nothing because he understands that true innovation comes from human connection, from caring about impact, not just profit. Her voice softened. Yes, something happened in Montana. We connected as people, not just CEO and assistant. And yes, we had dinner at Canlis. But do you know what we talked about? His dreams for this company, his vision for technology that brings people together, that makes the world better. She faced Turner directly. You want to use our relationship to destroy him? Go ahead. But first, explain how a man capable of love, of growth, of human connection is somehow less qualified to lead than someone who'd use blackmail and manipulation to get what he wants. The room was silent. Charlotte's heart thundered in her chest. She hadn't planned this, hadn't planned any of it. But standing there defending not just Harrison's company, but his heart, she felt stronger than she ever had. Harrison stepped forward, his eyes locked on her face. Charlotte! But the moment shattered as she swayed suddenly, the room spinning. The lack of sleep, the stress, the pregnancy. It was all too much. Her knees buckled. Harrison caught her before she could fall, cradling her against his chest. What's wrong? He asked urgently. Charlotte, talk to me. She looked up at him, seeing the fear in his eyes. The same fear he'd carried since losing Rebecca. And she knew she couldn't wait any longer. "I'm pregnant," she whispered. The words seemed to echo in the silent room. Harrison's face went completely still, his arms tightening around her. "The Christmas party," she continued, her voice trembling. "I've been trying to tell you, but with everything happening—" "Oh, this is priceless," Turner laughed. "Not just an affair, but a pregnancy. The board will do nothing." The new voice came from the doorway. Richard Henderson stood there, looking grimly satisfied. "Because as of an hour ago, Henderson Systems has revoked its agreement with Turner Tech." Turner's face drained of color. "What? Did you really think I wouldn't see through your tactics?" Henderson moved into the room. "You tried to force a merger to block our deal with Blake Technologies, but all you did was prove why Harrison Blake is exactly the kind of leader we want to work with." He turned to the shareholders. "The Henderson deal isn't dead. In fact, we're prepared to increase our investment, assuming Blake Technologies remains under its current leadership." The room erupted in chaos. Turner was shouting about contracts. Henderson was calmly dismantling his arguments, and the shareholders were buzzing with excitement about the renewed deal. But Harrison heard none of it. He was still holding Charlotte, one hand moving to rest, over hers on her stomach. "How long have you known?" he asked softly. "I found out in Montana. I've been trying to tell you, but I was afraid. After Rebecca..." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "That's why you've been ill. Why you wouldn't drink at dinner?" She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm sorry. I know this changes everything. If you don't want..." He kissed her, right there in front of the shareholders, Turner, everyone. It wasn't a passionate kiss, but a tender one, full of promise and possibility and future. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. "I lost everything once because I put work first," he said. "I won't make that mistake again. Whatever happens with the company, we'll face it together." As if on cue, Diane Foster stepped forward, clearing her throat. "I believe we have a shareholders' vote to hold," she said pointedly, "unless Mr. Turner would like to withdraw his bid." Turner looked around the room, seeing the tide had turned. With a snarl of frustration, he stormed out. The vote would be a formality now. Harrison had won, not just his company, but something far more precious. He helped Charlotte to a chair, kneeling beside her. Around them, the business of saving Blake Technologies continued, but in their small bubble of space, the world had narrowed to just them. "A baby," he whispered, wonder replacing fear in his voice. Charlotte covered his hand with hers. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" He smiled, and it was like watching the sun break through clouds. "No," he admitted, "I'm terrified. But I'm learning that the best things in life are the ones worth being afraid for." Outside, the Manhattan sunrise painted the snow-covered city in shades of new beginnings, while inside, two hearts beat as one, and a third tiny heartbeat between them, full of promise for tomorrow. The New York skyline glittered behind them as their private jet climbed through the evening sky. Charlotte sat beside Harrison rather than across from him, one of many small changes that marked their transformed relationship. His hand rested protectively over hers, their fingers intertwined on the armrest between them. The past 24 hours felt surreal. After the shareholders' meeting, everything had happened in a whirlwind. Harrison had appointed Diane Foster as interim CEO, while he took a 2-week leave of absence, something that would have been unthinkable just days ago. The press was already spinning stories about Victor Turner's failed takeover attempt, but, for once, Harrison seemed unconcerned with media coverage. "What are you thinking?" she asked, watching his profile in the fading light. He turned to her, his grey eyes soft with an emotion she was still getting used to seeing. About how many times I almost lost this chance. If you hadn't spoken up at the meeting, if you hadn't taken me to Montana, if I hadn't hired you 3 years ago. He squeezed her hand. So many moments that could have gone differently. Charlotte's free hand drifted to her stomach. Another habit she no longer had to hide. Are you really okay with all of this? It's happening so fast. Harrison was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. When Rebecca died, I convinced myself that love was a liability, that caring about someone meant giving life the power to destroy you. He turned in his seat to face her fully. But watching you defend me today, seeing your strength, I realized I've been looking at it backward. Love isn't a weakness. It's what gives us the courage to fight for what matters. Tears pricked at Charlotte's eyes. Damn hormones. Even if it terrifies you. Especially then. He reached out, brushing a tear from her cheek. I'm not going to pretend I'm not scared. The idea of being a father. He swallowed hard. But I'm more scared of letting fear rob me of this chance, of you, of our child. The word "our" sent warmth spreading through Charlotte's chest. I made an appointment, she said softly, for when we get back to Seattle. A proper checkup, maybe even an ultrasound. Harrison's eyes lit up with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. I want to be there for everything, no more missed moments because of work. Speaking of work, Charlotte bit her lip. We should talk about that. About my position at Blake Technologies. Ah. He sat back, running a hand through his hair. I suppose it would be inappropriate for you to remain my assistant now that we're together, she supplied with a small smile. Together, he agreed, testing the word. I've been thinking about that. What would you say to heading up our new Community Innovation Division? Charlotte blinked in surprise. What? Something you said at the meeting stuck with me, about technology that brings people together, makes the world better. His eyes were alight with enthusiasm now. We've been too focused on corporate clients. What if we created a division focused on developing technology for communities, schools, neighborhoods, small businesses? Harrison, she hesitated. I don't want you to create a position just because of our situation. I'm not. He turned more fully toward her. Charlotte, you've been more than an assistant for years. You understand people in a way I never have. The way you handled the Henderson deal, how you connect with clients. This isn't charity. It's recognizing talent I should have promoted long ago. Before she could respond, the pilot announced they were beginning their descent into Seattle. As the city lights appeared below them, Charlotte felt Harrison tense beside her. What is it? He was staring out the window, his expression troubled. I want to show you something, after we land, if you're not too tired. An hour later, their car pulled up to a quiet street in Madison Park. Harrison led her to a beautiful craftsman house overlooking Lake Washington. In the moonlight, she could see a "for sale" sign in the front yard. This was our house, he said quietly. Mine and Rebecca's. We bought it right after we married, thinking we'd raise our family here. He pulled out a key. I've kept it all these years, but I've never gone inside. Never could. Charlotte's heart ached for him. Harrison, we don't have to. Yes, we do. His voice was firm. I've been holding on to ghosts for too long. This house deserves to be a home again. He took her hand. Would you look at it with me? The significance of the moment wasn't lost on her. This wasn't just about viewing a house. It was Harrison choosing to face his past, to make peace with it. Together, they walked up the front steps. The key turned smoothly in the lock, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Inside, moonlight filtered through dusty windows, illuminating covered furniture and memories frozen in time. Harrison's hand tightened on hers as they moved through the rooms. In what must have been intended as a nursery, he stopped, his breathing ragged. "We never finished it," he whispered. "We were going to paint it yellow. Rebecca said it was a happy color, good for any baby." Charlotte wrapped her arms around him as he finally let his tears fall. Tears for Rebecca, for their lost child, for all the years he'd spent walling himself off from love. When the storm passed, he pulled back just enough to look at her. "I want to restore it," he said, "not to erase what was, but to honor it, to make it a home again. Our home, if you want it to be." Charlotte looked around the room, imagining. It transformed. Warm yellow walls, a crib by the window, sunlight streaming in, not erasing the past, but building something new from its foundation. "Yes," she whispered. "I want that." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, full of promise. When they finally left, Harrison locked the door behind them, but this time it felt different, not like sealing away memories, but like protecting possibilities. As they drove back to the city, Charlotte rested her head on his shoulder, their joined hands resting over their growing child. Above them, stars pierced the Seattle night, each one a tiny light of hope in the darkness. They still had so much to figure out, their new professional dynamic, the challenges of pregnancy, the complexity of building a life together while honoring what came before. But for now they had this, the quiet understanding that sometimes love comes not in grand gestures but in small choices. The choice to open a locked door, the choice to face fears, the choice to believe that hearts, like houses, can be rebuilt, stronger and more beautiful than before. 3 months later, spring sunshine streamed through the newly restored windows of the Madison Park house. Charlotte stood in the nursery, now painted the warm yellow Rebecca had once envisioned, watching Harrison hang a mobile of stars and moons above the waiting crib. The room had become a perfect blend of past and present, Rebecca's dream honored. In the color choice, their future celebrated in the modern furniture and technology Harrison had insisted on installing. "The baby monitor has artificial intelligence," he was saying, his enthusiasm making him sound boyish. "It can track breathing, patterns, sleep cycles, even predict when they're about to wake up." Charlotte smiled, resting her hand on her now visible bump. "And here I thought we'd just listen for crying." He gave her that soft look that still made her heart skip. "Can you blame me for wanting every advantage? I'm new at this. We both are." She moved to stand beside him, taking in the completed nursery. "But I think we're doing okay so far." The past 3 months had brought changes neither of them could have imagined that snowy night in Montana. Harrison had restructured Blake Technologies, promoting Diane Foster to permanent CEO while he transitioned to executive chairman, a role that let him focus on vision and innovation rather than day-to-day operations. The Community Innovation Division was thriving under Charlotte's leadership. Their first project, a technology initiative helping rural schools connect with global resources. But the biggest changes weren't professional. They were in moments like this. Harrison humming absent-mindedly as he assembled baby furniture, or the way he'd taken to reading pregnancy books in bed, sharing random facts about fetal development. Over morning coffee. "Did you finish in here?" called a voice from downstairs. "The movers are ready for the next room." "Almost done, Mom," Charlotte called back. Her mother had flown in from Portland to help with the move, and had been delighted to find Harrison equally obsessed with getting everything perfect for the baby. Harrison stepped back, surveying their work. "Just one more thing." He pulled something from his pocket, a small silver frame. Inside was the sonogram from their 12-week appointment, the tiny profile of their daughter clearly visible. "Where should we put it?" he asked. Charlotte considered for a moment, then pointed to the windowsill. "There, where the morning light can catch it." As he placed the frame, Charlotte noticed his hands trembling slightly. "What is it?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out the window toward the lake. I've been thinking about that night in Montana, about how I told you I didn't know how to let someone in without betraying Rebecca's memory. I remember. He turned. To her, his gray eyes bright with emotion. I realized something yesterday when we were painting this room. The yellow, it doesn't hurt anymore. It feels right, like she'd approve somehow. Charlotte stepped into his arms, fitting perfectly despite her growing belly. She'd want you to be happy. I know that now. He pressed a kiss to her temple. And I am happy. Terrified sometimes, but happy. From downstairs came the sound of furniture being moved, her mother's voice directing the movers. Life, messy and beautiful and real, filling the house that had stood empty for so long. Oh! Charlotte suddenly grabbed Harrison's hand, placing it on her stomach. Feel that? She's moving. Harrison's face lit up with wonder. A look she never tired of seeing. Their daughter had started kicking the week before, and each time it happened, he looked like he was witnessing a miracle. She's strong, he whispered, like her father. Like her mother, he corrected, the strongest person I know. Charlotte turned in his arms to face him. Do you ever think about how many things had to align to bring us here? The storm in Montana, Turner's takeover attempt, the Christmas party, he added with a slight smirk that made her blush. All of it. If any one thing had gone differently, but it didn't. He touched her face gently. Everything led us exactly where we were meant to be. From her pocket, Charlotte pulled out something she'd been saving for this moment, her old ID badge from Blake Technologies. Speaking of where we're meant to be, she placed it on the windowsill next to the sonogram, a reminder of where we started. Harrison smiled, understanding the gesture. Then he reached into his own pocket and pulled out something that made Charlotte's breath catch, the key to the house, the one he'd kept all these years. And this, he said, placing it beside the badge, is a reminder that sometimes keeping something locked away doesn't protect it, or you. Sometimes you have to open the door and let love in. Through the window, spring sunlight caught the key, the badge, and the sonogram, turning them to gold. Their past, their present, and their future aligned in a perfect moment of clarity. Their daughter kicked again, as if adding her own punctuation to the moment. Harrison laughed, a free, joyous sound that would have been impossible 6 months ago. I love you, he said, the words coming easily now. Both of you. We love you too, Charlotte replied, and felt their daughter move again, as if in agreement. Outside, cherry blossoms drifted on the spring breeze, dusting the lake with pink petals. Inside, a house that had held only memories was filling with new life, new love, new possibilities. And in the nursery, painted yellow, for a baby who had never arrived, a man who had locked his heart away, and a woman who had helped him find it again stood together, feeling their daughter dance beneath their joined hands. Some might call it fate, the storm that had trapped them, the crisis that had tested them, the love that had transformed them. But Charlotte and Harrison knew better. It wasn't fate that had brought them here, but choice. The choice to be vulnerable. The choice to trust. The choice to believe that love, even when it terrifies you, is always worth the risk. Their story hadn't ended in that Montana hotel, or in the New York boardroom, or even here in this sun-filled nursery. In many ways, it was just beginning. But now they faced each new chapter together, knowing that the greatest adventures aren't the ones you plan, but the ones that surprise you. Like a snowstorm, like a baby, like a love that breaks down walls and builds bridges to tomorrow. The end. That was a beautiful story, wasn't it? I hope you enjoyed it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your collaboration is very important to me.